Welcome to the High Museum, to the Hill Auditorium, and the first folk art program for the calendar year 2007. There will be another later on this year. It is our plan to have two programs in the area of folk art or contemporary self-taught or outsider art every year. And those programs, like this one, will all be open to the public. Let me introduce our panel first, although actually let me interrupt myself first and say and shill our book. We're here to, the impetus for putting this panel together was the publication last month of Sacred and Profane, Voice and Vision in Southern Self-Taught Art that was edited by Carol Crown and Charles Russell. And all four of us up here have essays in this anthology. It's a beautifully produced book and is really advances the cause of scholarship in the field in just the kind of way we want to see it go forward. Let me introduce my fellow panelists first. To my left is Professor Charles Reagan Wilson, who's the director of the Center for Southern Culture at the University of Mississippi, and he's the author of numerous books on art, religion, music, and culture of the South, including Judgment and Grace in Dixie, Southern Face from Faulkner to Elvis, published by the University of Georgia Press. He's also co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press. And a lot of you may have that original edition, which was published in 87?
89.
89. A big, thick table book. And it is being reissued, in case you don't know, in a new version that is divided into volumes by subject. We're all eager to see that new edition come out. To his right is Carol Crown, who's professor of art history at the University of Memphis, where she served as chair of the department from 1981 to 1992. She was curator and editor of the exhibition and catalog Wonders to Behold, the visionary paintings of Murtis West, and she recently curated and edited the nationally traveling exhibition and catalog Coming Home, Self-Taught Artists, the Bible, and the American South, that was published by the University Press of Mississippi. And then to Carol's left is Charles Russell, who is director of the American Studies Graduate Program, associate director of the Rutgers Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience, and associate professor of English at Rutgers University in Newark. Among his books are Self-Taught Art, The Culture and Aesthetics of American Vernacular Art, published by the University Press of Mississippi, and Poets, Prophets, and Revolutionaries, the Literary Avant-Garde from Rimbaud through Postmodernism, published by Oxford University Press. We decided that the way that we would like to open up the discussion here and sort of get the ball rolling is for each of us to talk for just a minute, 5 minutes, about a different aspect. Now, you have 4 academics up here. We'll see how that works out. About a different aspect of what makes Southern self-taught art different from self-taught art in other parts of the country. And let's see, Dr. Wilson is going to talk about the history of the South and how it plays into that. Carol's going to talk about religion and the different aspects of religion. Charles Russell is, forgive me, there are too many Charleses and Carols up here. It's confusing. Charles Russell is going to talk about race. He's going to wind up with race, and before he does, I'm going to talk a little bit about vernacular and folk manifestations and their appearance in contemporary self-taught art. So, Charles Wilson, will you start, please?
I'm going to talk about Southern history, and I have 5 minutes.
You can.
Of course.
You can take 6.
Susan noted that we're academics, of course. This reminded me of the time I had the privilege of introducing B.B. King at the University of Mississippi, and we honored him, we awarded him the status as an honorary Southern Studies professor. Now, he was really quite moved by this recognition from his home state and all this, and we had a little press conference afterwards, and he went on a little too long with one answer, and he finally stopped himself and said, "Well, I'm sorry I went on too long, but then again, I am a professor." Well, the place for me to begin history really is with storytelling, because so much of our storytelling grows out of our history. Eudora Welty, in her memoir, One Writer's Beginning, tells a wonderful story about when she was a little girl in Jackson, Mississippi. Sunday afternoon, she would go for a ride with her mother and her mother's friend. She'd get in the car and fluff her dress down and say, "Now start talking." And they did. And writers like Welty soaked up these stories that had been passed down often from generation to generation to generation through the South. And this is a good beginning place to think about a Southern sensibility, because that's really what I want to talk about, is a Southern sensibility, a Southern distinctiveness. And how did that happen? When did that happen? The search to understand what has made the South a distinctive place has a long history, as indeed has the self-conscious South itself. But it does have a history. It hasn't been a given, hasn't been the same in all time periods. The term South, to refer to the southeastern area of North America, goes back to the early 19th century. If you had been in the colonial period and you had talked about the Southern interest, you would have been talking about probably economics or crops that might differ from New England. People weren't brought together, people from the southern colonies with New Englanders or Middle Atlantic people, the way they would be later. But in the early 19th century, this emotionally charged idea of the South emerged. Southern culture took on a new self-conscious aspect that has been with us ever since. Now, it's usually related to the growth of the sectional consciousness, sectional crisis related to Missouri and the admission of Missouri in 1820. People in the South became aware of themselves as people who were different than people in other parts of the country because they had interests like slavery, but there were a lot of other things that went with this as well. They were brought together increasingly with people who were criticizing them, abolitionists in the 1830s, for example. So you had this kind of defensiveness arise, all of which led to a very self-conscious Southern sensibility. Publications that use the term Southern in them suddenly appeared. It's really interesting when you look back. Even in the early 19th century, there were not magazines that said Southern this or that. There were not books that said Southern this or that. But in the 1820s and 30s, all at once, you had the Southern Literary Review, Southern Literary Quarterly begin publishing. You had the Southern Review begin publishing. These represented intellectual efforts to look at the South and try to define itself as a distinctive place. At the plain folk kind of vernacular level, you had a similar thing going on in music. A man named William Walker, Singin' Billy was his name, was in the upcountry of South Carolina, and he published a songbook called the Southern Hymnody that was the first collection of songs, religious songs, that were rooted in the South. It sold 400,000 copies within 10 years. 400,000 copies. There was something going on with this self-consciousness about people in the South. But the Southern sensibility goes back even further than that, the result of regionally defined social relations that, all the way back to the colonial period, made the South a distinctive place. The system of honor as a value system that became so deeply rooted in the South. The class divisions of a hierarchical society. The expectations about men and women's behavior in a paternalistic society. The evangelical worldview that appeared at the end of the colonial period, and above all, the obsessions with race in a biracial society. All of these had really appeared in the colonial period and took deep root as providing the values and structures for a Southern sensibility. Now, partly this came out of the fact that it was an agrarian society. This was a face-to-face society of the South in our early history. And the environment was so important to that. Southern artists, from the beginning, lived in a place that stimulated their senses in terms of the efflorescence of the environment, the sights and sounds and smells, the flora and the fauna that are often exotic to people who aren't from here. All of this made for a distinctive sense of place that early on in Southern history gave our artists a perspective, a distinctive perspective from which to view the world. There are also things like language that were rooted in the agrarian world that had taken root on the frontier and the South really remained a frontier rural society for a very long time. And I have to read this quote, my favorite quote in all of Southern culture. It's from Zora Neale Hurston, the African-American writer. Quote, "An average Southern child, white or black, is raised on simile and invective. They know how to call names. It is an everyday affair to hear somebody called a mullet-headed, mule-eared, wall-eyed, hog-nosed, gator-faced, shad-mouthed, screw-necked, coat-bellied, puzzle-gutted, camel-backed, butt-sprung, battle-ham, knock-kneed, razor-legged, box-ankle, shovel-footed, unmated so-and-so. Southerners," she concluded, "can furnish a picture gallery of your ancestors and a notion of what your children will be like, all of it full of images and flavor." She added that the rural Southern folk were not given to book reading, and so they take their comparisons right out of the barnyard and the woods. So this rural life in Southern history early on and through, the South was the last part of the country to really urbanize and industrialize, and so that rural frontier country quality remained a very important part of us. You also had religion, and I'm going to let Carol talk more about that, but I did want to show you some of my church fans. Now, some of you will remember church fans. This was air conditioning before air conditioning. It goes back to the palm fans that are a long tradition. But in the early 20th century, printing companies began making these cardboard fans very inexpensively, and usually they were funeral homes would buy these and put them in the church pews. This one, very peaceful scene of a country church, autumn. My idea is this is the Southern image of heaven on here. Very peaceful scene, Christ the Lambs. Imagine you're in a hot Georgia church. Surely heaven is this cool mountain scene. Often these are just commercial items, and the backs sometimes didn't fit the front. This sacred scene on the front, the back says, "Stop, rest, eat, and sleep at Howard's Snack Bar and Motel." Very much a biracial tradition. Here you have two little girls with the message of a little African-American girl, "Go to church." And these are the kind of things that unified Southern culture. We know now about how diverse and complex the South was, with all the different subregions, the Delta, the Piney Woods, the Piedmont, the upcountry, the mountains, the beach, all of this. But things like church fans unified the South across race, class, and these different divisions. Let me make one other point, because I know my time is running out. And that is that if the South has been distinctive, it's within the American nation, because Southerners have always claimed the nation as well as the region. And this goes back to the fact that Southerners were among the formative leadership of the American Revolution. Think of Washington and Jefferson and all of those amazing leaders. When the Confederacy established its independence, they really copied the American Revolution and a lot in the American government. The Constitution was basically a replica of the American Constitution with a few changes, protecting slavery. They added God, a specific reference to God in the Confederate Constitution, but otherwise it was pretty much the American Constitution. What image did they put on the seal of the Confederacy? George Washington. George Washington. This linkage with America. And this continued through the 20th century, this combination of regional identity and strong American identity as well, with the patriotism that the region has exhibited. The disproportionate number of Southerners in the military, both at the leadership and enlisted level. So many other ways, claiming nation and claiming region. My friend Willie Morris used to say you couldn't go wrong in the South using the word juxtaposition. And that's it. Southern nation. Sometimes they were in conflict, as in the Confederacy and the Civil War era, Civil Rights era, certainly that was often a conflict. But at the same time, there were two identities that are the background, I think, for much of our art and music and culture in the South.
Lottie. He's given me evangelical Christianity to talk about. Before I do that, though, as I began to think about tonight's comments, I thought about my colleagues up here, and I thought, we're the most diverse group in terms of the subjects we've studied. Susan Crawley comes out of an art historical museum studies background, never thought she'd have anything to do with folk art. My colleague here, historian, I dare say he probably never knew he'd be speaking in the high about folk art when he began his course of study. And I know this northern boy didn't either, here from Rutgers, who is a scholar of, his PhD is in English literature, and he's published on avant-garde topics and things I don't really understand. So you probably want to know now what I'm from, Kansas. But also, I came to this study by looking at medieval art history. That's what I hold my doctorate in. And as I've been poked fun at tonight by these two, the field of administration. I spent a long time at the university in administration. And so what I'm trying to point out here is it's a vast array of different scholarship, different programs, different ideas that bring us together to look at this art and to try to understand it within the context of the world in which it was made. And that was our job, all of us, in looking at Southern folk art in our book, Sacred and Profane. And so we're in the sacred part of the talk now. We're emphasizing that. We'll go to the profane when we go over here to Charles. When I began looking at Southern self-taught art, I had no idea what I was getting into. And I related to it very easily because it looked familiar somehow. And the first book I encountered was American folk art, the Corcoran Show, the Corcoran catalog. And I saw it and I said, this stuff is wonderful. It reminds me of Mozarabic manuscript painting. I know you wouldn't get that, but it was so abstract and flat and visionary. And it was grounded in the Bible. And being a scholar of medieval art history, I understood that. It made sense to me. And when I began to read about the art and think about it, and I thought, nobody's really dealing with the religious issues. And I can still hear Finster saying, they want me to paint, but all I want to do is preach. And as I began to look at it and think about this art, all I was doing was applying what I'd learned from looking at medieval art history to contemporary self-taught art. And many of these artists were speaking in a language I recognized. The subject matter over and over again was grounded in the Bible. It made sense to me. So as I began to look at this and having to think about the imagery I was seeing, and above all, did I see Revelation imagery? You can't deal with Murtis West without looking and thinking about Revelation. And what I found out was something I should have known, but I came from Kansas, what can you expect, was that those living in the South, you all know this, are more likely to say that religion is important than any other region of the United States. Duh. And more people living in the South are more likely to be evangelicals than anybody else in the United States, any other region. And of that, we would say Baptists first, and probably the Southern Baptist Convention most of all, and then the Methodists and Presbyterians. And, of course, then reading my Gallup polls, trying to back up that there is a Gallup poll that demonstrates that this is the Bible Belt, by the way. It can be documented. But I also learned, as you all knew from watching television, that nearly a quarter of people living in the South consider themselves to be members of the religious right. So I'm putting all my, evangelical and then all of it together, and I say, I wonder what this means about the art. The art which is grounded in so much religious imagery. And I kept coming into contact with that word, evangelical Protestantism, big word. Evangelical Christianity, more or less the same thing. And I thought, well, hell, what does it mean? I mean, I was brought up Methodist, but evangelical Christianity, what does it mean? And I realized what with that political right tossed in, that these must be the most conservative Christians in the world. All the Gallup polls backed me up. And I began to think about, all right, conservative Christians. within the evangelical tradition, what does that mean? And I guess what it meant, I came to find out, was that we had the real, narrow, literal, Bible-believing Christians down on that end, and we had the more broadly expansive, well, maybe I can think a little bit about symbolism here on that end. But it was all evangelical, okay? Often when we think of Southern Christianity, we think of fundamentalism. Oh, those Southerns, they're fundamentalists. Well, there's a great saying. And the saying is, let's see if I can get this right, all fundamentalists are evangelicals, but not all evangelicals are fundamentalists, okay? All are evangelical, but there's a segment that are the most literal, Bible-believing, Bible-thumping people in the world. All right, okay, now I've got that down now. I understand a little bit more about evangelicals. I understand a little bit more about conservative evangelicals, but what do they believe? So I began to deal with that issue, and I was reading some of Charles Reagan Wilson, too. He has some good thoughts on that in Judgment and Grace and Dixie. And what you discover is what I knew growing up in the Methodist Church in Kansas, is that this is a religion of powerful personal experience, that one has in it a direct access to God. And evangelicals believe in this personal relationship to God to the degree that they have what you all know as that conversion process of being born again. So when you think about Southern evangelicals, you have to think about personal, direct, religious connection to God, and also a heartfelt expression of this relationship to God. Okay, got that down. What else? Well, the thing that binds all these evangelicals together, whether they are Bible-thumping or maybe a little bit more expansive in their beliefs, is that they believe in the Bible. That is the first and foremost principle of this tradition. And in this tradition, you may have those that believe that God made the world in 7 days. Period. Flat out. That's how it happened. But you could also have people saying, well, you know, there may be 7 days, 7 decades, 7,000, 7 million. It doesn't matter. What matters is God made the world. But whether they believe in this literal or this more expansive version, they all believe in the Bible as having the answer to life's questions. It's the great authority in this tradition. So I always think of, you know, you have the Bible's authority. What else? Well, you have that felt conversion. You must be born again. I feel like I'm a preacher. Maybe give me a fan here for a second. You have that, amen. You have that born again conversion. And, of course, these evangelicals believe also that you have to witness, because if you have the good news, you got to have everybody else have that. You know, you got to preach it and teach it. And the last thing that joins them all together, I think, is belief in the Bible to the degree that you believe in prophecy, or what is called prophecy belief. You believe that what the book of Daniel, Revelation, parts of Matthew, and other sections of the Bible say about the future will come true. So I said, okay, I'm getting this under my belt. And one of the best books I read about the whole thing was Paul Boyer's When Time Shall Be No More, Prophecy Belief in America. He used to say he'd take his Schofield Bible on the planes with him to see who he would attract. And he would get in some really great conversations with people about their Bible beliefs. But it could be a really demanding thing for a scholar. You know, we're supposed to be secular humanists. I'm not sure I know what that means, but I think it means that we're not supposed to be evangelicals, okay? But it is a situation that you need to look at from a scholarly point of view. Now, I know I'm taking my minutes. In Memphis, okay, we have thousands of people come every year to see Elvis and make the pilgrimage. But I'll be darned if there's but maybe one scholar at the university that takes that for serious. In other words, scholars can look at prophecy belief and say, ho-hum, can't mean anything. And then there's the rest of the world out there, and a whole bunch of them in the South, believing this. And isn't that worth our investigation? I bring this up because when I began to look at contemporary self-taught art, I found revelation everywhere. And I saw religion everywhere. And I found art that was intended to be dogmatic, tell you what to believe, didactic, I'm going to convince you what to believe, but also, like Minnie Evans, meditative and contemplative and beautiful in that sense. So that's what I'm bringing to the table tonight. It is an art I think we've studied and looked at, and you can't ever go beyond, or you can't escape its religious connections. But there's another and a flip side to that, and that's its grounding in the profane. And that's your turn now, Charles.
No, sir.
It's my turn, actually.
Oh, darn.
It was a
I
good
missed
lead.
that. It was good. I worked on that hard.
Catch that.
Yes.
I didn't set you up. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's perfectly all right. Well, you were expecting to be Charles. How could you? It just occurs to me, did I introduce myself?
No.
I don't know. Well, I don't know whether it's because I think that everybody already knows me or because I don't think you care, but I have a really bad habit of forgetting to introduce myself. Here, I'm Susan Crawley. I'm the Associate Curator of Folk Art here at the High. And I have a graduate degree from Georgia State in modern and contemporary art history, and contributed to the Sacred and Profane book. And and I can do a commercial right now. I also have two recent installations that are up in the museum right now. Louis Monza, From Politics to Paradise, on the lower level of the Wheelan Pavilion, and the new installation, and this is actually germane to this discussion, a new installation of our small but really wonderful collection of 19th century folk art on the third floor, furniture, pottery, quilts, and that kind of material. So by all means, go see it when you get a chance. And I'm charged here with talking about vernacular and folk traditions, their persistence in the South, and how they influence contemporary self-taught art to the extent that they do. And there certainly are a lot of folk traditions that are still practiced in the South: pottery, basket making, quilting, storytelling, as Charles one mentioned a minute ago. And then there's singing traditions like blues and sacred harp singing that are still widely practiced. Some of the examples of folk tradition that do influence contemporary self-taught art are pottery, which is still being practiced in much the same way it was 150 years ago by family potteries, or in-family potteries like the Metters and the Hewells in North Georgia. But Virginia artist Georgia Blizzard made clay sculptures that were often in the form of vessels and sometimes not, that are clearly influenced. And the important point is that they were made out of the local clay that she dug herself, and that's clearly influenced by the South's strong pottery tradition. Basket making is not a tradition that seems to have very much influence on what we think of as contemporary self-taught art in terms of painting and sculpture and so forth. But African American women on the South Carolina coast still make baskets that they sell as decorative items, especially to tourists. And they vary from traditional forms to very elaborate, very decorative items that are made especially for the tourist trade. And then, of course, quilting has recently been very much in the limelight with the G's Ben Quilt Show that brought a community of African American quilters from Alabama into national prominence in a show that foregrounded their work as important abstract art of the 20th century in America, and at major museums like the Whitney and the Cleveland Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston that organized the show, and of course here at the High. And then we also see the influence of quilting in works like Nellie Mae Rose, of which the High has such an extensive collection, where she butts big areas of color up against each other in a very quilt-like or patchwork-like way. There's probably nothing that seems to be more generative than whittling. There are so many examples of men who've taken, and it's usually men, though not always, taken traditional Southern pastime of whittling and made it an art form, such as Ulysses Davis or Edgar Tolson or S.L. Jones, just to name a few of them. And then others who've taken that whittling tradition and turned it into bas-relief sculpture, often to tell a story. Herbert Singleton, Elijah Pierce, Ned Cartledge from here in Atlanta, Leroy Allman from Tallapoosa. And then others who've translated into stone carving, which gives it a sort of extra flourish of high art, if you will, like Tim Lewis or Raymond Coins. And then there are craftsmen who worked in a number of media but also made furniture, like Leroy Person, who took chairs and turned them into not just expressive instruments, but expressive often of religious conviction. Then there's another entire category of skills that were learned in farming or industrial practice that makers have taken and applied to art making. Like Ronald Lockett, whose tin snipping techniques he learned from his uncle Thornton Dial, who had lived on a farm but also worked in industry, and Dial also, in his own work, used Bondo, automotive sealing compound, and he used welding and a host of other techniques that were gleaned from his own practice, making a living. And then Charlie Lucas, who uses a lot of the same techniques to create his assembled sculptures, and Charlie grew up on a farm. Then there are crossovers from other vernacular forms, like storytelling. Storytelling just keeps coming up in the South. And unfortunately, it seems to be vanishing as part of daily life. This is my own personal observation. This is empirical, not statistical. But it seems to me that it's vanishing as a part of daily life as life itself speeds up. But we've already mentioned it in the work of people like Pierce and Allman and Cartledge and Singleton. And all of those people, this is important, I think, they all portray either Bible stories or parables, Bible stories and parables or group history of the groups they belong to. And history does appear, especially at significant moments in African American history, from slavery to contemporary civil rights images, and in works from Leroy Allman to Ned Cartledge. It's surprising to me how rarely folk tales are translated into visual form, as opposed to Bible stories, without which whole bodies of work wouldn't exist. And there are a few exceptions to this, like Charlie Kinney, who liked to draw bear hunts and haints, and Thornton Dial, who does use animals to stand in for humans in much the same way that African American tales, in much the same way that animals stand in for humans in African American tales that are derived from African stories. And then there's the blues, which is a vernacular form, of course, and they often appear depicted in self-taught art. One artist who uses them a lot is Leroy Allman, and when they show up, it's very often as a symbol of the ungodly life. And in fact, the blues, among many African Americans, have been for a long time considered the devil's music as opposed to righteous gospel or spirituals. And then there's the vernacular nature of a lot of expression that derives not from craft or from traditional forms, but from mass culture, such as Sam Doyle's yard shows that functioned as a community photo album, a giant community photo album. Eddie Arning and William Hawkins' works that actually take their imagery, that appropriate their imagery from mass culture, commercials and ads and so forth. Juanita Rogers, whose reworking of cartoons that she saw on TV are so fascinating. Royal Robertson's drawings that were influenced by science fiction and comics and various other sorts of mass media productions. And then, of course, Howard Finster's use of various folk heroes like George Washington, Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, And I got to say Coca-Cola, or to give it its correct pronunciation, Coca-Cola, which figures so largely in Finster's production that he had to have thought of it as a hero. One of my favorite quotes from Finster, or from a work of Finster's, is, "Remember, in hell, there'll be no Coca-Cola." And then, of course, there's the adaptive reuse of available Reed vernacular materials like house paint, plywood, roofing tin, rope, old textiles that appears in so much work by self-taught artists. Of course, these things are not entirely limited to the South. They're not exclusive. You see folk elements in the work of Martin Ramirez, whose show is gaining so much attention in New York right now. In tramp art, of which we have a couple of examples in the third floor galleries now, that's a form that comes from folk decorating traditions from Germany and Scandinavia, and it's not a particularly southern form. You see carvers in wood and stone elsewhere, although I don't think that you can find any place where they're as concentrated as they are here in the South. And memory painters appear everywhere. There's Mattie Lou O'Kelly and Linda Anderson, just as examples from here in the South. And there's also Grandma Moses, who was from New England. But it is interesting to note to me that our memory painters seem to keep painting those memories long after memory painters in other parts of the country had died, probably because those vanishing ways of life that they portray lingered on and still, to some extent, linger on here so much longer. And there are always exceptions to these rules. Mary Shelley carved symbolic cows that originated from her growing up on a dairy farm in New York State. And there's Tennessee native Joe Light, whose paintings have much more than his upbringing or his surroundings or anything Southern about him reflect his own idiosyncratic Judaism. Well, what about Bill Traylor and William Edmondson, the sort of pinnacle to many people's minds of Southern self-taught art or contemporary folk art? Well, Traylor painted scenes from farm life very often, but he did not treat them as sentimental or nostalgic genre pictures. And he and Edmondson both express themselves in forms that are pared down, minimal, in forms that have a great deal in common with the simplifications of modernism, which is very important because I think that very lack of folkiness in Traylor and Edmondson contributes to the positive, and contributed to the positive attention they got back in the 40s and even now, including recent Procrustean attempts to wrest them from their context and replant them in the modernist canon. Excuse me. Traylor and Edmondson were the artists who probably most easily plucked out of their context and their vernacular context, and most quickly and thoroughly accepted by museums. They're in the collections of MoMA, the Met, and other museums that don't typically collect folk art. In fact, one's tempted to say that the vernacular element may work against the acceptance of folk art in more traditional institutions. Now, the High Museum has works by almost all the artists I've named, works full of the vernacular and folk aspects that I've talked about. But that's partly because we've committed to collecting that material. We have an entire folk art department. And we also have in our decorative arts collection that choice group of traditional art objects, true folk objects like pottery and quilts and painted furniture that have long, for some years, been an important part of the decorative arts collection. Thank you. Charles?
Well, actually, I think I'm tempted to start with a story.
Go ahead.
But I'll spare you. Yes, I'm a self-confessed Northerner, and I'd be afraid to try and keep up with the best. And actually, what I'm going to spare you a little bit more is knowing that I was coming last, I actually wrote my paper because once I start talking, it goes on and on and on, and then we'd like to actually hear from you and get into a conversation, so I'll read. So there's a definite time limit here. I really want to thank you. I want to thank you all, and certainly Susan, for the opportunity to present our book, to share some of the formative ideas, and to open discussion with the audience about what we've been doing. Mm-hmm. Our book emerged from a number of public and private discussions among many people in the field of self-taught and outsider and folk art as an effort to expand scholarly study and informed public consideration of this often marginalized art. Carol and I wanted to contribute especially to analysis of what's been recognized for several decades now, that the South is a remarkably fertile source of strong and rewarding vernacular art. We believe this is because the region in many ways provides such complex and often contentious perspectives on both regional and national culture and political issues. And because Southern vernacular artists come from all segments of the population, the art that's produced by this region during the past 7 decades is remarkably diverse and goes beyond 7 decades, easily into the 19th century. But thinking about the type of artists that we've been talking about primarily is, within the 20th century and into the 21st. Now, my work starts from the very basic, indeed obvious premise that significant art embodies singular individual vision, the act of seeing and responding to common shared experience in a way that others may recognize the collective and the personal through that individual artist's distinctive aesthetic sensibility. So when Carol talks about the importance of religion in the art, and she uses the phrase powerful personal experience about religion in people's lives, I'm interested in how that powerful personal experience, whether it's sacred or profane, is actually the basis of powerful personal art that we respond to. So I'm interested in how art emerges out of these many experiences. So therefore, within a region so marked by conflicting tensions between regional and national identity, between traditional and modern values, between religious and secular orientations, and most notably by the long, troubled history of race relations, the encounter between the artist and the viewer through the specific artwork can be rich and a very complex experience. So there are many entries into the art of Southern vernacular artists. The focus of my brief comments today, was on the latter issue, the experience of race and race relations in this art. There's so much to say, so in this aspect, I recall the very succinct statement of William Ferris. The struggles of white and black people to live together is the central theme of Southern history. No aspect of the region's life can be understood apart from race. This is true whether we regard the work of white or black Southern self-taught artists. But African American vernacular art especially expresses both collective values and behaviors and distinctly individual responses to the challenges of being black in America. Reading race and race relations in the work of black Southern artists brought up in a society that discouraged strong and direct personal statement is, of course, a complex matter. We need to be especially sensitive to how racial issues may help shape the content and the form of art, as well as how the act of creating locates the individual artist in relation to his or her audience, an audience perhaps addressed directly, or an audience by which the artist may not wish to be noticed. That is, we need to inquire into the manifest and latent or hidden intentionality and self-assertion of the artist. This may be difficult because just as segregation and oppression fostered intricate and subtle patterns of individual and communal strategies of resistance, coexistence, and independent cultural growth within the general African American populace, they contributed to the creation of a range of aesthetic strategies among vernacular African American artists. African American Southern society, both rural and urban, is an organic and productive culture whose members can call upon long-standing cultural traditions, some with African roots, others regional or national origin, that are externally imposed or freely adopted, but then modified and made singularly African American, in order to establish a space of personal statement, social connection, and aesthetic freedom. As Paul Arnett has pointed out, the racial conditions within which African American artists find themselves should not be considered, quote, coercive, self-sufficient, or proscriptive of human agency. Instead, while helping to shape the form and content of art, they present themselves to artists as both challenges and as occasions of transformation, re-examination, and the creation of a new perspective. Now, I'd like to suggest that it's especially important to observe African American art through the lens of history, noting particularly the artworks produced under Jim Crow and those that emerged during and subsequent to the Civil Rights Movement and the transformation of the political positions of blacks in southern states. Subject matter, aesthetic form, and most especially personal statement need to be read with a sensitivity to historical specificity. Race relations may or may not provide the content of the work. Specifically, African American vernacular visual traditions may or may not determine the form of the artwork. And the voice of the artist may or may not announce a racialist intention. But we need to be attentive to racial inflection in the work and in our own response to it. Consider, for example, how race in subject, form, and voice may play out in some general types of vernacular art of the African American artists in the South during the past 70 years. As Carol has pointed out, many Southern self-taught artists, white and black, have observed society through the frame of religious interpretation and have directly addressed their audiences by presenting pointed commentary on contemporary life, judged according to the themes of redemption and salvation. We should explore in general and in specific cases, such as Sister Gertrude Morgan, the dynamics of personal voice, social commentary, and the use of African American traditional interpretations of biblical texts within the racial and class context of the artist and their audience. For instance, what is and can be said and what's left silent? Who is addressed and why? And what authorizes and protects the artist's personal testimony to these varied audiences, chosen or listening in? Alternatively, while such religious ministry is not uncommon among Southern self-taught artists, many African American vernacular artists who emerged during the early and mid-20th century provide a more private, if not guarded, sense of the individual's social observations and personal responses to the world and to history. Artists such as Bill Traylor and Clementine Hunter were acute observers of their society and commented, however subtly, on their times and on the history of the South. Their work evidences a strong sensitivity to individual life within communal experience. And if the willful recollection of earlier times, as found in the memory paintings of Hunter, do not directly influence the aesthetic form and personal vision of artists like Jimmy Lee Sudduth or Mose Tolliver, in many works of theirs, we sense a world fading, an exuberant but fragile subject, and a singular moment of time observed, illuminated, and affirmed, yet already passing. In the work of a number of contemporary artists, however, the time that is changing is the present, rapidly becoming the future. Artists such as Thornton Dial, Lonnie Holly, Purvis Young, and Joe Minter, for instance, recognize their place in contemporary history, specifically the political and cultural transformation of the South. Their subjects are the forces and the significant moments of change, and especially the dramatic events of the Civil Rights Movement and the opening up of social, economic, and political opportunities for African Americans in the New South, the very forces that allowed the emergence of these self-consciously political, self-taught African American artists. Significantly, the formal strategies of their work are also freed from traditional artistic content and genre, whether religious teachings or portraits of individual subjects presented on empty, non-referential grounds. Rather, these self-taught African American artists declare their freedom and role to observe, record, judge, and instruct audiences, both black and white, on the cultural values, secular as well as sacred, and always racial, of their time and ours. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. That was, I hope, stimulating and has given you all in the audience things to think about and questions to ask. I'd like to go ahead and open up the session for questions from the audience and from the panel. We'll just mix it up here. Yes. Oh, excuse me a second. I'm sorry. I think, yes, if you don't have a microphone, we won't catch you on the recording. But we want to know later what you said.
This is really just a question of definition, but you were kind enough to give us the range in the definitions from fundamentalism to evangelicals. How do you make distinctions between self-taught art and outsider art? Where's that overlap and that distinction? How do you make it?
I'm laughing because it's such a big question.
Right.
It's haunted all of us forever. Where do we begin? Look how they smile. Outsider art comes out of a tradition that emerged and was considered and developed in Europe with the ideas of Jean Dubuffet having to do with art brut. Okay? It lands over in the United States, translated into not art brut, but outsider art, referring to the art of people with emotional and sometimes physical disabilities. Okay? In the South, and those outsiders making art out of these unusual emotional states were often self-taught. In the South, we have not located and identified as many outsider artists. Rather, I prefer at least, I don't know how my colleagues feel, but I like the umbrella term of self-taught. And within that, there is, I think, some validity in talking about outsider art. Observations, suggestions, insights?
Yes, I'd like to add that outsider art is a somewhat burdened term because it comes, even translated and used as freely as it is in this country, it still carries some of the connotations of disability or mental illness that it had originally when it was first coined. And it was coined by Roger Cardinal in 1972 as a translation of Dubuffet's term art brut. Yeah, right, it's not a literal translation at all, but a parallel term. But there's another problem with it here, and that is that it has been changed in this country, or the use has been changed to mean an artist who functions outside the mainstream art network or art market. But that's also somewhat tainted because it hints at someone, and partly because it still carries its connotations from Europe, it hints that artist is outside culture, is isolated. And people often read it to mean the artist is an isolate. And it is certainly true, and particularly true with the work of Southern self-taught artists, that they are deeply embedded in their cultures, and that if you take them out of that cultural context, you're missing an awful lot of the richness and the meaning in that art.
So many of us say we don't use the big O word.
There are a whole lot of words we don't use. We're running out.
To give my perspective on this definitional issue, as a historian, we feel like the art historians know this language better than we do. But something that Susan mentioned a minute ago struck me about the cultural context, because that, as a historian, is really what I'm interested in, is in my case, the Southern cultural context that produced this art, and how it relates to other aspects of Southern culture as well. And so the term vernacular is often in my writing a term that I will use, because it suggests a folk culture that it comes out of, and it's, to me, related to vernacular music, whether it's the blues or religious music or other music that was deeply rooted in folk cultures in the South. So it's been interesting for me to understand or try to understand the theoretical definitions and to make use of those within the kind of work that I do.
Other questions?
You've spoken a fair amount about content and voice and history and political issues. You haven't spoken a great deal about the aesthetic side. You did speak some about some of the flatness, which reminded you of certain religious pieces from medieval times, but could you speak a little bit about some of the stylistic characteristics, some of the aesthetics of this work, and what makes it special and so beautiful and appealing?
It's wonderful. What can we say? The way I look at it, this art is a fundamentally conceptual art. That is, its concerns are with ideas, concepts, and feelings. And it chooses, I think it chooses, to use a language that is abstract, okay, but based in the representational world, which means that you'll often identify figurative imagery in it, and you'll know what's going on, especially if you know the story. If you know the Bible story, if you know the folk tale, if you know whatever the context is. It will often be flat, two-dimensional, decorative, linear, sometimes filled with four vacui, extraordinary color, and in some ways fitting to what it's attempting to express. Your turn.
Yeah. Yes.
It's the South is so rich. There are so many artists, and so the art emerges from people's daily lives for so many reasons that if you start talking about the aesthetics of Southern self-taught, you'll find many strategies, many visual strategies, many forms of visual sophistication and meaning. Just the list of people that Susan mentioned in terms of the strong folk tradition, whether it's whittling or construction of yard environments, as well as testimony, illustration, and personal interpretation of biblical passages. It's, again, one of the reasons why we realize that the South is so important for the production. There's so much going on, and there's so many different types of people creating and working with the complexities here. I think, indeed, we need to talk about the aesthetics. I think that there are so many great artists here, but we'll find ourselves to talk on one hand about the flatness, the singular positioning of a figure on a relatively empty ground or non-referential ground in Tolliver or in Sudda, something like that. And then we step over into the realm of Thornton Dial, where the ground is, the world, and you can struggle to find the image within that ground, and the relationship between that is entirely different strategy and takes us somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But I think the aesthetic question has to be asked all the time, because we're here in a museum and we're here because we love the work. It affects us powerfully as visual statements, and we need to talk about them. Yes, we need to recognize the cultural context. Yes, we need to recognize the biography, but we're here because they're artists.
Certainly there's no one aesthetic. In fact, it's so broad and the forms of expression are so varied that for every example you can give, as Carol and Charles were just doing, you can turn right around and find another example of a Southern self-taught artist who does the opposite thing. And so it's very difficult, and because this art is so varied and it doesn't adhere to any sort of school, it's very difficult to establish aesthetic criteria. It's also true that while some of these artists have a great deal of technical dexterity and technical skill, many of them don't, and the power in their work comes from, well, power. When I'm looking for art to try to bring into the highest collection, one of the primary things I'm looking for is power of expression, and the effectiveness of the means the artist chose for that expression. And it's sometimes a very interesting conversation with the people who have to approve my selections in the museum, who are not. We were all trained academically. We all went through art history school, but because they have less exposure to this material, and may not have as much. It may not have as much affinity for it, or may, but it's. Sometimes it can be hard for them to see what it is that I find so compelling about a particular work of art.
I think our appreciation of self-taught art and is helping us become aware of the importance of the visual culture in the South that has been underexplored and underappreciated. We know the South is an oral culture, and I think that has gotten much more attention. And it's true. We talk about storytelling, which is an oral form in so many ways in the South. The South is not, we haven't produced really a kind of well-known theologians, for example. But we produce preachers, world-class preachers, Billy Graham, Martin Luther King, people of oral, verbal gifts about conveying the gospel. And we know that, and the South is an oral culture. But I think the visual culture was so deeply rooted in the South, and we haven't recognized it. In everyday life, historically, think of those signs that used to be so pervasive, white and colored. That shaped the visual landscape. And help to structure the kind of race relations that Charles was talking. Think about religion. You're driving down the road. Jesus saves. Get right with God. Prepare to meet thy God. I saw a handwritten note under one of those prepare to meet thy God signs recently that said last chance. Carol's prophecy, I think, here. And so I think these artists are really attuned to this visual world that has been out there, and both in the southern landscape, but also, of course, in popular culture. So many of them have lived through the mass culturalization of the South, and so they're television celebrities and movie stars. There's Elvis, as Carol said, that's so pervasive in a lot of folk and vernacular and self-taught art. But it's that appreciation they have of the visual and how you convey that in really basic ways.
Yes. Wait, Lynn.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's okay.
We want you on the recording.
Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to go to that wonderful symposium in New York City the end of April. I understand they're going to talk at one point about the future of the field. And I've observed some exhibitions which combine modern art, contemporary art with self-taught art. I was telling Charles's wife about a show I saw at MoMA called The Raw and the Cooked. It was just wonderful. They had juxtaposed, love that word, juxtaposed, for example, Minnie Evans with Paul Klee. They had done a Paul Klee portrait and a Minnie Evans portrait. It was just a very exciting, stimulating show. I want to ask the panel members if they think we will see more of this, more of the masters of self-taught going into these exhibitions. I just want to hear some opinions about that. Thank you.
Actually, I should have Allison up here. I get all my ideas from her. One can only hope. There are so many different things that go to create an art world and an art market and the institutions that support that or enshrine those worlds, such as the museums. The tradition of the avant-garde, the tradition of self-conscious innovation and constant cultural change in art history is so much ingrained in our understanding of what modern art is, the age of modernism and postmodernism, where the innovative artists, the avant-garde artists struggled against the academy to establish new ways of seeing and thinking and presenting. That has become the academy. The avant-garde now is the academy, and that's what's called postmodernism. Glommed onto that is a very, very significant art investment world. So much of the art world needs and expects constant change and the newest, latest thing. And most of the artists in the academy or in the mainstream, as it's called itself, in the franchise, people who believe they have the franchise for art, really need to see themselves in art history moving in a particular direction. Self-taught artists, all the art that we talk about, vernacular art, is art created outside the concept of art history, outside the concept of making something that will affect the definition of art and the role of art. Given that, it's very hard to imagine that the vernacular, the self-taught, is really going to find a place in the world, except that within the concept of postmodernism, there is a self-critique. There is a sense that the idea of progress and the idea of certain values can be questioned, can be undermined, and there is the idea of appropriation, of looking for many different visual languages and visual forms to bring in to the world, sometimes to rip off, appropriate, and sometimes maybe even to romanticize. But there are critics and there are curators and there are instances of museums being open to the different visual languages, I think within the context of postmodernism, in the context of multiculturalism, in the context of many different ways of rethinking art. But as long as art history and the market of investment drives that, I think it's going to be very hard.
Other questions? Yeah.
I'd like to know, with maybe one of you or all four of you have discussed with your African American colleagues about their feelings concerning Southeastern self-taught art, specifically African American self-taught art. It seems that most of the people that are interested and study this field tend to be white people, and judging by the audience and the four of you were predominantly white people that study and read about it and write about it and publish it. What is your experience discussing this field with your African American colleagues? How do they feel about African American art? Is it taken seriously, or do they look at it as white people feeling it's more of a minstrel sideshow type amusement.
I think that the African American folklorists are interested in it in terms of the themes that often come out of African American history. You know, you'll have the celebration or interest in black folk heroes. You know, whether it's from Joe Louis to Frederick Douglass, their images will often appear in self-taught African American art. And of course, Dr. King is a pervasive figure, and so for folklorists, I think they are very interested in it. I think historians, in general, you know, this is something I'm always trying to get them to appreciate is self-taught art to looking at it in terms of the South or African American history, that it needs to be more mainstream, just as we look at politics or economics or whatever. I'm for looking at culture, and that's not just music or literature, but also this art. I think it's a harder sell for African American historians, although they're interested in civil rights. That's the major theme of so much African American history now is taught and researched, and so that appears as a theme certainly in African American self-taught art. So I think it varies depending on the field and what they see as they can draw from it in terms of their own work.
I think it's a very, very difficult issue, and there's a lot of different positions. There are a significant number of strong black artists, Betty Saar, Alison Saar, for example, David Hammonds, a number of people who draw upon vernacular visual culture and make their art and both testify to and recognize those as sources of contemporary art. On the other hand, there is among a good number of artists, trained artists, schooled artists, African American artists, who have been working to find their place within the so-called mainstream, within the market, within art history, who recognize that they draw both from ethnic cultural traditions, but also from Western artistic traditions, and want to be regarded as serious, as accomplished, as significant as any other white artists, who are deeply suspicious of, and if not resentful of, the vogue, or what's perceived as vogue, of self-taught among white collectors, white museum people and critics. It reeks of, to some, of primitivism, and as I would say, long tradition. I say the long record of whites in power adopting the work of the folk, black folk, blues, or such, and sort of seeing the primitive and romanticizing the primitive and regarding African American culture as basically primitive in some kind of a vacation land of deep feeling, but still separate from and not brought into the cultural tradition. I've had conversations with very strong African American artists who do resent, like, oh, what is, why are so many artists who are serious artists who see themselves in the line of addressing the issues that have shaped modernist avant-garde art regarded only secondarily? It's a problem. Yes, the majority of people who collect African American art, self-taught art, are white, and the majority of people who show it are white. The majority of people who write about it are white. And I think we need to recognize and understand, okay, what do we learn from art? What do we learn from artists? And how do we learn or respond to art from our culture, made by people within our culture who have a problematic relationship with the cultural world that many of us are privileged to inhabit.
You also asked about what do our colleagues think, our African American colleagues think about this. And I sat here and I thought, okay, how many African American colleagues do I have that are art historians that study self-taught art? Let me rephrase that. How many white scholars at university settings study self-taught art? And there's you, and there's me, and there's you.
I'm a literature professor.
You're not at university, you don't care. They are very few. I have a colleague that has written on African American art. His name is Babatunde Lawal. He comes from Nigeria. He was the first chair of excellence in art history at the University of Memphis. He is still an adjunct professor. And I love performing with him. We go on our dog and pony shows about self-taught art and have the best time. But until this subject matter is made integral to the field of art history, you won't have many white or black, Chinese or other, study it. And unless we look at it seriously and teach it. And there are very few institutions that teach it. My colleagues are very good. You know, I'm the avant-garde with them, the medievalists that decided to turn Southern. But, you know, if we don't care enough about communicating our love and enthusiasm for it, there will be no one to write about it. And so I guess that's why I so firmly believe in the educational process. This art is so profound for me that sharing it with my students, I had one go with me to New York to see the Ramirez show. She was just overwhelmed. But of course, you know, I want to take them to all these things, but there aren't scholarships to take these kids. You know, you're going to spend a week in New York, costs money. Luckily, we had enough friendship there that we were able to stay with some people and take care of her and so forth. But, you know, now I'd like to take 5 of them. But you can't take them on these trips, even to the high. You've got to provide some, and there's not the financial help to do that. So that's just my 2 cents worth.
One of my colleagues, who is African American, a curator, at the African American adjunct curator here, is an artist himself and has a PhD in art history and is now teaching at Emory as well. And when he first came here, he shared that extreme discomfort with about self-taught, African-American self-taught art, and it's because it's collected mostly by white people, and for all those complex reasons that Charles was talking about. And I understand his discomfort, and I understand the problem. And he and I have been talking about it since he's been working here, and he's coming around. I think we're beginning to find a middle ground. Michael was never anything other than extremely open to conversation and to thinking about it. But he included a trailer in the paper trail show he did last summer. And also another example, Eugene Metcalf, who wrote the article that laid out the first article I expect that laid out the argument against white collecting of self-taught art by African Americans in Black Art, Folk Art, and Social Control. How long ago was that published? The 80s, but the early 80s. to mid-'80s. And he has had a complete change of heart, apparently, because he's now writing articles or writing essays for the catalogs that the Arnett's are putting out on Thornton Dial and other artists. So it's not static. There's some flux in it, but the problem certainly remains, and it's certainly still it's complex and it's thorny and it's very sensitive. It's real.
As a follow-up to this discussion, I'm curious, just in general, if you have any statistics on those who influence the art market, the art world anyway. I mean, it's predominantly a privileged white world who the collectors, the art historians, the art educators, the curators at the institutions that have influence, are these not primarily privileged white people? I mean, is this not just really a reflection of the art world in general? I mean, do you have any statistics on that? Do you have any clue, how many black curators and art educators and art historians and collectors we have?
I suspect there may be some institutions that do, but
has statistics, yeah.
we don't. With this.
Right.
I would go to the American Museum Association, the College Art Association. They may, they should.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting that when you get into the ranks of curators, the opinions are more varied. Alvia Wardlaw, who's a curator of modern and contemporary art in Houston, at MFA Houston, has been very active in promoting and showing art by self-taught African American artists, for example. And she's not the only one. There are other curators who are vehemently, African American curators who are vehemently opposed to it and very, very vocal about it. So it's as I said, it's complicated, it's sensitive, and it's a real thing. It's a real problem. And I think my own point of view is I think that the real crux of the problem is the scarcity of white collectors who collect art by trained black artists, more than it's the comparison of the two that's disturbing. Why do white collectors collect art by artists, by African Americans who are not trained and not part of the formal system, but don't by highly skilled artists who do have formal training? And that's the...
Then again, we could go into a whole other conversation and mention Kara Walker, in which,
yes,
there are a lot of people who are very concerned about who buys Kara Walker and who brings her prices up, and there are a significant number of African American artists and academics and culture critics who find that very problematic. What are people buying and what are they getting off on?
Is it time to quit? Okay. Is there one more question? All right. Then thank you very much for coming. I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion, and I hope that you'll come back to the next folk art program when it's announced here at the High. And if you buy our book, I'll sign it for you. Create his assembled sculptures, and Charlie grew up on a farm. Then there are crossovers from other vernacular forms like storytelling. Storytelling just keeps coming up in the South. And unfortunately, it seems to be vanishing as part of daily life. This is my own personal observation. This is empirical, not statistical, but it seems to me that it's vanishing as a part of daily life as life itself speeds up. But we've already mentioned it in the work of people like Pierce and Allman and Cartledge and Singleton. And all of those people, this is important, I think, they all portray either Bible stories or parables, Bible stories and parables or group history of the groups they belong to. And history does appear, especially at significant moments in African American history, from slavery to contemporary civil rights images, and in works from Leroy Allman to Ned Cartledge. It's surprising to me how rarely folk tales are translated